Hi, I wanted to really quickly go over the chapters for this module and talk about some of the more important information and hopefully show you around the site so things will be a little easier for you. At least that's my plan. In chapter 4, we really learn a lot about DNA, and hopefully a lot of this is a review for you. We learn about the genome sequencing, which has already occurred and really has changed the way we practice medicine. Think about PCR testing and how many tests we can do now with PCRs, and that's all because of this genome project. And really now it's gotten so cheap that we're doing a lot of this, and when it first came out it was super expensive, but now it's really fairly reasonable. We also talk about prenatal testing, looking for genetic disorders, and the chorionic villus sampling, amniocentesis. And so you need to read about those, pre-implantation genetic counseling for diseases. If you have for instance, now on the prenatal testing, we can tell if someone is a carrier for sickle cell, so they know their carrier state from their genetic testing that is done at birth with the PKU testing type thing. If you're not familiar with that, let me know and I'll go over that. They're also talking about chromosomal abnormalities, and so that we know that chromosomal abnormalities are the leading cause for mental retardation, but they often end in fetal miscarriage. So a lot of these children that would have had problems are aborted early, so just kind of keep that in mind. And then you need to know a little bit about DNA replication, where the basic stuff that you should have learned in undergraduate biology. If you don't understand X-linked inheritance pattern, you really need to review this. Remember, the dad has one X, so if the dad has a particular disease, say Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, it's carried on the X chromosome. If he has that disease, he has that on his X chromosome. So 50% of his daughters are going to be, 100% of his daughters are going to be carriers for this particular disease. Okay. But even though he has this disease, his sons will not be affected because it is carried on the X. All right. If the mother is the carrier, so then this mother goes on to have a baby, and so she has two X's. The dad has an X and a Y. Right. 50% of her daughters are going to be carriers, and 50% of her sons are going to be affected by the disease. Okay, so just kind of review that if you don't remember it. Note the difference between genotype and phenotype. Okay. Know what autosomal dominance and autosomal recessive diseases, what the inheritance pattern looks like with those as well, and know some of the major ones in that category. If you can kind of remember, most autosomal dominant diseases are not terrible, because people would have died out, right? Because you're going to get it if it's exposed to it. But autosomal recessive diseases tend to be the more serious diseases. Things like sickle cell, cystic fibrosis. There's quite a few of them. Then you need to be aware of some particular genetic disorders. Critic-Cat, which is a 5p deletion, microcephaly, hypotonia, wide-spaced eyes, which is called hypertelorism, low-set ears. Low-set ears is really a problem with a lot of genetic disorders, and if you want to know if someone's ears are low-set, let me try to see with this camera here. Your ear, when you take a line from the back of your eye, the helix of your ear should be above the back of your eye. Okay, so that I'm probably not mentally because my helix is above that. But if you see an infant and you draw that line back there, if you have low set ears, then you do have to be worried about some kind of genetic disorder. Sometimes it just happens, especially positional, like the baby's head will be kind of squished down in there or whatever. So it's not 100%, but it is something to look at. Then you need to know what the P and the Q part of the chromosome, okay? The P is the short end of the chromosome, and the Q is the long end of the chromosome. Because you'll see that more and more, that they'll say that the gene 45X from the 5P chromosome is missing or whatever. So you'll see those kind of very specific terms for that. You need to know some genetic terms like recessive and dominant that we've already talked about. The disorders like cystic fibrosis, retinoblastoma, neurofibromatosis. And neurofibromatosis is a pretty awful disease. They have different varying degrees of expression. So there's type 1, type 2. But the big thing with neurofibromatosis, if you have an infant with 7 or more cafe au lait spots, and those are, cream with coffee spots on their body, and or one underneath in their axilla area, underneath their arm, you have to be very concerned for neurofibromatosis, okay? And if you've ever seen someone with neurofibromatosis, they have little fibromas all over them, and they're pretty easy to identify once you've seen one. So if you haven't seen one, look up a picture of them. The second most common genetic disorder that causes mental retardation is Fragile X. You also need to know about Klinefelter syndrome. That's one of the things you're going to see. In Chapter 5, it goes more into a lot of the terms and in other things that cause disease, okay? So we have genetic diseases, which are, your genes are there or they're not. But then even with the genes being there or not, sometimes they're expressed or not. And so Chapter 5 goes more into that sort of things. So it talks about incident rates, and prevalence rates, and polygenetic things, and empirical risk and relative risk. I have a separate video on relative risk. I think that's really important to know because you'll see a lot of studies talk about the relative risk of a particular disease. And if you look on your resource page here, you will see that I have some articles on paternal age, and in those articles they talk about relative risk. So without understanding what relative risk is, you can't really understand those articles. So that's something important to know. And then you also need to know about empirical risk as well. Then there are diseases that are multifactorial, and I think most of us are aware of this. Heart disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, schizophrenia also are all multifactorial. Now in your book, there is one disease that they talk about probably not being multifactorial. And I read that and I thought, that doesn't make any sense to me, so I went and looked it up, and it's actually not true. So I do have the article evidence to show that, and I would love for you, because this book is not perfect by any stretch, so if you find stuff that's wrong in the book, errors in the book, look up, find if you can find an evidence-based article to back up your position, and share them with me and the class, because that's how we all learn. This book now is a little old, and there's some errors in it. There were some errors in it to begin with, and now some of them are blatant. So I really would like for you to identify those errors. Some of them I'm aware of, some of them I'm not. So the one thing that in the book, it says that emphysema is multifactorial, and I don't have the article on this computer, but I will add it to your list here so you can see that in fact it is. So that's one of the questions on your test, okay? Then it talks about like things that you can modify with a lot of disease states. For instance, if you have a predisposition for heart disease, you can modify certain things to prevent or limit the amount of heart disease you have by, exercise, diet, that sort of thing. The same goes for colon cancer and breast cancer and Alzheimer's, really. So that, for instance, with breast cancer, we know that being overweight increases that risk because fat stores estrogen. So, and we know that increased estrogen is a problem with breast disease, with breast cancer, or at least certain types of breast cancer. So that is something that we can modify. Also, having a diet low in vitamin D can increase your risk there. There's a lot there. But there are genetic predispositions. So you have the BRCA and the BRCA1, BRCA2 genes for breast cancer. But remember, they also affect ovarian cancer and in men, prostate cancer. So they don't just affect women. So just be aware of that as well. And then we go into chapter 6. Let me see. Also, I got a little note here. Just remember, type 1, we think about diabetes as being diabetes, but type 1 and type 2 diabetes are almost like two different diseases. So kind of be aware of those. You'll be learning a lot more about those in upcoming classes and upcoming courses. Okay. Chapter 6. Here we go into more specific diseases. Again, we talk about Prader-Willi. If you're not familiar with that, become familiar. That is a 4MB deletion on chromosome 15q from the dad. Okay? Angelman syndrome is a 4MB deletion on chromosome 15q from the mother. Okay? So just kind of be aware of the differences there. So we've got Angelman, Prader-Willi, Beckwith-Wiedemann, Russell-Silver. Those are some things that you need to know. Turner syndrome, Marfan's. And so I have included in there a website that, let me see, I'm going to bring it over here to you. That's really good. And I have this website included in your resource information. And you can basically look up any disease and it'll tell you frequency, cause, inheritance patterns, that sort of thing. The one thing it doesn't have, and it has a printable PDF, so there's some really good information in here. The one thing this does not have is pictures, but you can Google pictures, so those are kind of, to me, pictures say a lot, so I really like looking at those. But you can look at any number of diseases over here, okay? So just kind of look through these and just be familiar with those main ones. Okay, so let me just kind of go back to this resource page here, and pretty much you'll see this familiar pattern or same pattern with other things. I'll go through some PowerPoints, and then I do a little study notes where I've gone through the PowerPoints and just kind of added some notes or like shorthand. This is not to replace these. I'm just trying to give you multiple ways to kind of learn this information. One tip I would suggest you doing, and then these web resources, and just at least look at these. Even if you don't read it, look at them and know what's out there, what's available to you. One way I would suggest studying for this class is to read the chapter summary, do the quiz questions. So the quiz questions are there. If you don't know the answer to the quiz questions, then go look that up. That's a good way to know that you don't know that information. Read the chapter summary. If you don't know what it's talking about, go look that up. Because you can't read everything. There's just too much reading, so you have to be very selective of what you read. So don't read stuff you know, read stuff you don't know. A lot of this you're going to know, it's going to be a review, but some of it you're not going to know or have forgotten and need to go back and review it. So I also have a thing here on SOAP notes. We really, during this course, during your F&P program, you're going to be doing a lot of SOAP notes. You kind of need to know what SOAP notes look like. and how to use the old CART system, which is just one mechanism of trying to gather information. When you look at your case study this week, you'll see that I mentioned a couple of different times. History is where we get the majority of our diagnosis. Okay, so learning how to take a really good history that's relevant to the patient is important. So you want to know this history of present illness, and then you're going to want to do your review of systems relative to the chief complaint, whatever that is. If the chief complaint is cough, then your review of systems is going to do with, you know, shortness of breath, difficulty swallowing, difficulty breathing, you know, that sort of thing. So it's going to be, you know, head, heart, lungs. You're probably not going to ask them, unless for some reason they lead you down a path that you would, about constipation and that sort of thing. Your review of systems needs to be relative to your chief complaint, unless they give you more information. So then I've got some concepts that you kind of need to know here about that we talked about. Oh, one thing I didn't mention was neural tube defects. I was going to say super common. Well, they're not super common, but they're not unusual either. So you need to be looking for those and know what spinal bifida occulta looks like, okay? Because that's what you're going to see more than anything, and you might see it in the primary care setting. It might get missed in the hospital if you have a baby in there. So you got these trisomies. We see trisomy 21 normally. Trisomy 13s and 18s do occur, and they are surviving, so they're out in the community. Not very long, but they're out there for a short period of time. Fragile X. So know all these particular disease or genetic diseases, okay? All right. So after this week is finished, I will publish another video where we're going over the case study so we can kind of learn from that together. But as you go through the case study, think about why. Why would you think this? Why would you not? Because that's where you're going to communicate to me what you learned, okay? The point of this course is not to test you to death or to do busy work, but because that is definitely not the goal here. But I really want you to gain this information so that you can use it in practice, okay? So the only thing APA I'm going to be particularly concerned about is your references. They better, you need to do references right. If you get a graduate degree, you need to know how to do APA references. But writing style for this class, not so much. So you can do bullet points for me. That works for me really well because it's easier to see. But when you do your references, then you need to do those correctly, and you need to do an insight in your in-text references correctly as well. Those are pretty easy, and the reason I want you to do that, one, is I do check references. So if you say something that I'm like, I don't know about that, I will go back and look and see if it's something that I'm unaware of or something new, or maybe something you've misunderstood that you've read. So anyways, that's important to do. I hope this little overview helps you.